Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to have you back for another quiet inquiry. Tell me, is there a paper before you tonight? A letter unopened, an account not yet settled? Watson always said that ink, once dry, rarely lies, though the hands that shape it sometimes do. Do subscribe, so no forged page escapes your notice. Now, draw nearer the lamp, for as Holmes believed, it is the smallest detail that betrays the greatest deception. Find us also on the Watson's Margin Spotify channel. The link waits below. Chapter 1. The Road to Ashcombe Hall. Of the many winters that I have shared with Sherlock Holmes, none pressed upon London with quite so merciless a hand as that of the year of which I now write. The Thames had begun to skin over with ice near the wharves, cabmen muffled themselves to the eyes, and even the sparrows of Baker Street had abandoned their accustomed perches for the shelter of the eaves. It was upon such an evening, with the wind driving fine snow against our windows in hissing gusts, that Holmes and I sat before a fire built rather higher than our usual economy allowed. He, with his violin idle across his knee, I with a medical journal I had long since ceased to read. "You are not attending to a word of that article, Watson," said he suddenly, without so much as glancing in my direction. "I confess I am not," said I, setting it aside. My mind was on the weather, and on how few clients a man might expect on such a night as this. "And yet," said Holmes, rising and crossing to the window, "I hear a cab even now struggling against the drifts in the street below, and unless I am very much mistaken, it means to stop at our door." He was not mistaken. Within a few minutes Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, and there entered a tall, elderly gentleman, his greatcoat crusted with snow, his face drawn with a fatigue that seemed only partly the result of his journey. He introduced himself as Sir Edmund Vale, of Ashcombe Hall in Northumberland, and begged our pardon for calling at so unseasonable an hour. "You have travelled a very great distance in very poor condition, Sir Edmund," Holmes observed, drawing a chair nearer the fire for him. "I judge from the state of your boots, still caked with a particular reddish clay, quite unlike our London mud, that you did not come directly from the railway station, but stopped first at your club to leave a message, and only then thought better of waiting until morning." Sir Edmund gave a short, surprised laugh, though there was little humour in it. "You're quite right, Mr. Holmes, in every particular. I wrote to my solicitor, telling him I could wait no longer, and then came straight here. My business will not keep." He proceeded, once warmed by a glass of brandy, to lay his trouble before us. He was the owner, he explained, of Ashcombe Hall, a considerable estate upon the Northumberland moors that had belonged to his family for some 6 generations. Bordering his park lay nearly 800 acres of woodland, timber and grazing of no small value, which had always been reckoned an inseparable part of the estate. "A fortnight ago," said he, "a clerk from the county registry office, engaged upon some general revision of old records, came upon an entry which purports to transfer that woodland from myself to my cousin, Colonel Marcus Vale. The entry bears a date some 6 years past, the proper seal of the registry, and the signature of old Mr. Ashworth, who was registrar in those days, and who died, Mr. Holmes, more than 4 years ago. Everything about it appears in perfect order, and yet I give you my word as a gentleman that no such transfer ever took place. I have no memory of it, no correspondence touching upon it, and no reason under heaven why I should have given away a third of my patrimony to a man I see perhaps twice in a 12-month. "A forgery, then, in your view," said Holmes, his eyes half closed, but, as I well knew, missing nothing. "So I must believe, yet the seal is genuine, the paper is of the correct age, and the hand is unmistakably Ashworth's own, or so my solicitor assures me. I am an old man, Mr. Holmes, and not a wealthy one, whatever appearances suggest. If that woodland goes to my cousin, I do not know how I shall meet my obligations. Worse, I do not know whom to trust." Holmes questioned him closely upon the circumstances of the discovery, the character of those about him, and the present location of the disputed volume. It was this last point that seemed to engage his attention most particularly. "The registry book itself," Sir Edmund explained, "has been removed temporarily to Ashcombe Hall under proper authority, so that it might be compared page by page with my own private deeds, which have never left the house. My solicitor, Mr. Doring, believed this the surest way of resolving the matter quietly, before it becomes a public scandal. But now, with this dreadful snow, the roads are all but impassable, and I fear it will be a week before the volume can be safely returned." "Then," said Holmes, opening his eyes fully at last, "I think we'd better see it before it is returned, Sir Edmund. Watson, I fancy a few days upon the Northumberland moors, however inclement, will do us both a great deal more good than the London fog. You will wire ahead, Sir Edmund, that we are coming?" Our client's relief was evident and touching. He assured us that a room would be prepared, and that his household, though thrown together somewhat awkwardly by the storm, would receive us gladly. We travelled north the following day, the train labouring through country already deep in snow, and were met at the little station by a farm sledge, there being no possibility of a carriage upon such roads. The drive to Ashcombe Hall was a memorable one, the moor stretching white and silent to the horizon, broken only by black clumps of gorse and the distant huddled shapes of sheep. The hall itself, when at last it rose before us through the failing light, was a grey and gabled pile, handsome but weathered, with smoke rising thin and hurried from a dozen chimneys against the darkening sky. We were welcomed at the door by Sir Edmund himself, and I confess that even in that first hour I formed a distinct impression of the household into which the storm had thrown us. There was Colonel Marcus Vale, Sir Edmund's cousin, and the apparent beneficiary of the disputed entry, a handsome, easy man of military bearing whose geniality seemed a fraction too readily assumed. There was Miss Eleanor Vale, Sir Edmund's niece, and heir presumptive, a young woman of quick intelligence whose dark eyes moved from face to face with an attentiveness that matched, I thought, something of Holmes's own. There was Mr. Percival Doring, the family solicitor, precise and grave, a man who seemed to weigh each word before he permitted it to leave his lips. There was young Mr. Adrian Bell, a clerk sent from the county registry to safeguard the volume, ink-stained and nervous. There was Dr. Lionel Harcourt, physician and old friend to the family, comfortable and reassuring in manner. There was Mrs. Agnes Merton, the housekeeper, dignified with 30 years of service, who saw to our comfort with quiet efficiency. And there was Mr. Silas Trent, the estate steward, a weathered, watchful man whose business it was to know every acre of the disputed woodland better than any person living. All were courteous, all professed themselves eager to see the matter resolved, yet as the evening wore on, and the talk turned inevitably to the registry entry, I noticed, as I believe Holmes noticed also, a curious uniformity in the questions asked by our fellow guests. Scarcely one of them inquired whether the entry might be false. Almost every one of them asked in one form or another whether it might be overturned. Holmes said nothing of this at the time, but as we were shown to our rooms that night, with the wind still howling about the old gables and the snow piling in soft drifts against the windows, he paused upon the stair and remarked in that low voice he reserved for his most private thoughts, "It is a curious thing, Watson, that in a house full of people anxious for the truth, so few of them seem to doubt the lie." I had no answer for him, and indeed none was expected. We parted for the night, and I confess that despite the day's fatigue, I lay long awake, listening to the storm and wondering what manner of business had brought us to so isolated and so watchful a household. Chapter 2. The Sealed Library. Morning at Ashcombe Hall brought no relief from the storm. I woke to find my window blind with frost, and when I drew back the curtain, the moor beyond had vanished altogether behind a curtain of driving white. Breakfast was a subdued affair, the household gathered about a table too large for the 8 of us, and I could not help but notice how carefully each guest avoided any direct mention of the registry volume, as though its very name might summon some ill fortune upon the house. It was Sir Edmund himself who broke the silence, addressing Holmes across the length of the table. "You will wish to see the library, Mr. Holmes, and the arrangements I have made for the book's safety. I flatter myself they are thorough." "I have no doubt of it," said Holmes, "though I should be glad to judge for myself." We were conducted immediately upon rising to the library, a long, handsome room panelled in dark oak, with a single door opening upon the main corridor, and 2 tall windows overlooking the eastern lawn. Sir Edmund pointed out, with evident pride in his own foresight, that the windows were secured from within by heavy iron fastenings of an old pattern, and that the book itself, together with the family's private deeds, had been placed within an iron deed-box of considerable weight, the single key to which hung upon a fine chain about the neck of Mr. Doring. "No one enters this room after 10 o'clock, said Sir Edmund, "and the key never leaves Doring's person, waking or sleeping. I do not see how any dishonesty is possible." Holmes made no reply to this, but moved slowly about the room in that curious stooping manner of his eyes close upon the floor, the hearth, the shelves, as though he read the chamber as another man might read a book. I had seen him thus too often to interrupt him, and contented myself with watching Sir Edmund's growing impatience and Dorring's more studied composure as the examination proceeded. At length, Holmes straightened. "A well-secured room, Sir Edmund, as you say. I observe, however, a narrow strip of melted snow beneath this window, though the fastening above it appears undisturbed." He knelt again beside the sill. "And here, upon the hearthrug, a small smear of ink, blue-black in colour, still faintly tacky at its edges did I not know it must be some days old. And upon the upper shelf of that bookcase," he indicated a shelf some 7 feet from the floor, "a patch where the dust has been disturbed, though nothing upon it appears to be missing." "Melted snow, ink, a little dust," said Colonel Marcus, who had followed us in with an air of amused tolerance. "You make a formidable case out of very little, Mr. Holmes." "I make no case at all, Colonel," Holmes replied equably. "I merely observe. Cases are built later, and generally out of firmer material than a housekeeper's neglected dusting." "Doctor," Harcourt laughed at this, a comfortable, rumbling laugh, and the tension of the room eased somewhat, though I noticed that Holmes's eyes had not left the disturbed patch of dust even as he spoke. Dinner that evening was a more elaborate affair than I had expected, given the circumstances, and I confess that the company acquitted itself with a politeness so exact as to seem almost rehearsed. Colonel Marcus, in particular, was in excellent spirits, and ventured over the fish to remark that land disputes were, in his experience, a good deal less dangerous than family disputes, since the former could always be settled by lawyers, while the latter generally could not be settled at all. "That is easily said by the party who stands to gain, Marcus," said Eleanor, and there was an edge to her voice that seemed to me sharper than the jest deserved. The Colonel's smile did not waver, but I saw Dorring glance up from his plate with quick attention, and as quickly return to it. Mr. Bell, seated somewhat awkwardly between Trent and myself, addressed himself earnestly to Holmes upon the subject of the Registry volume's removal to the Hall. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes, that such a book does not leave the county office lightly. It is a heavy, fragile thing, and the law is most particular about its custody. It was only Sir Edmund's ill health, and his inability to travel to examine it himself, that persuaded the Chief Registrar to permit its removal at all, and then only under proper seal and my own personal charge." "A most conscientious arrangement," said Holmes, "and one which does you credit, Mr. Bell." The young clerk flushed with evident pleasure at the compliment, though I thought I detected beneath Holmes's courteous tone a certain private amusement whose object I could not then determine. It was shortly after 10, as the servants cleared away the last of the dessert, that Mrs. Merton entered with the coffee, setting the tray before Sir Edmund with her customary quiet competence. I happened to glance at the hall clock, visible through the open library door beyond, and remarked idly that it showed 5 minutes past the hour. "The clock has been unreliable since the storm began, sir," said Mrs. Merton, addressing herself to Sir Edmund rather than to me, though it was I who had spoken. "I have asked Trent to look at it, but he has had no leisure, what with the roads and the drifts about the stables." Holmes drew out his own watch, compared it silently with the clock, and said nothing at all, though I observed that he noted the discrepancy with the same close attention he had given to the melted snow beneath the window. The evening ended early, the company retiring by 10:30, wearied, I think, less by the day's exertions than by the effort of appearing at ease with one another. I had been asleep perhaps an hour when I woke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor beyond my door, soft but unmistakable upon the old boards. I rose, and opening my door a crack saw only the retreating figure of Dr. Harcourt, moving away from the direction of Sir Edmund's chamber toward his own. "Forgive me, Watson, if I have disturbed you," said he, pausing at the sound of my door. "Sir Edmund suffered a spell of chest pains not half an hour since. Nothing serious, I think, but at his age one takes no chances." I expressed my sympathy and my hope that our host would be well by morning, and returned to my bed, though sleep was slower in coming than I could have wished. When I mentioned the incident to Holmes the following morning, he received it with a thoughtful nod, but offered no comment beyond a single observation, delivered as we descended together to breakfast. "In a house cut off from the world, Watson, the most valuable clue is very seldom who could have entered a room. It is, far more often, who found it necessary that everyone else should believe the room had never been entered at all. I had no time to ask him what he meant by this, for at that moment a cry of consternation reached us from the direction of the library, and we hastened forward to learn its cause. Chapter 3. The Vanished Folio. We found the library in a state of considerable disorder, though nothing, at first glance, appeared to be broken or disturbed. Mr. Doring stood before the iron deed box, its lid thrown back, the chain that had held the key still looped about his neck, but hanging loose and empty against his waistcoat. Sir Edmund leaned heavily upon the mantel, his face grey. Mr. Bell hovered at his elbow, wringing his hands in a manner that struck me, even in that first confused moment, as somewhat theatrical. "The volume is here," said Doring in a voice carefully controlled. "But the entry, Mr. Holmes, the disputed entry, is gone, cut clean from the binding." Holmes crossed the room in 3 swift strides and took the great book from the box, laying it open upon the reading table beneath the window. I looked over his shoulder and saw at once what was meant. Where 2 leaves should have stood, bound fast with their fellows, there remained only a narrow ribbon of paper, the merest fringe, still caught within the stitching of the spine. "The door was locked the whole night through?" Holmes asked, without lifting his eyes from the mutilated binding. "Locked, and the key never left my person," said Doring. "I slept with the chain about my neck, as I have done each night since the volume arrived. I woke this morning to find it precisely as I left it." "And the windows?" "Fastened as you saw them yesterday, Mr. Holmes," said Sir Edmund. "I examined them myself not 10 minutes since. No footprint mars the snow beneath either sill." Mr. Bell, finding his voice at last, stepped forward with an eagerness that seemed to me almost relief. "The pages must have been gone before ever the book was placed in the box, Mr. Holmes. I examined the volume myself upon its arrival, and I distinctly remember the entry. I could not mistake it, and it was whole then. I would take my oath upon it." "I saw it also," said Colonel Marcus, who had come in behind us still in his dressing gown, his customary ease somewhat blunted by the news. "Yesterday afternoon, when Doring and I compared it against the old maps. The entry was there, Bell, whole and entire, as you say." "I didn't examine it closely," said Eleanor from the doorway, her voice low. "I had no cause to." Holmes bent low over the binding, drawing from his pocket the small glass with which I had seen him examine 1,000 lesser mysteries, and studied the severed edge for a long minute in perfect silence. When he straightened, his expression was that particular stillness which I had learned, over many years, to associate with the discovery of the first importance. "The cut," said he, "was made with a blade of remarkable sharpness, and quite recently, within the last day, I should say, judging by the freshness of the exposed fibres, which are white and slightly furred, as new-cut paper always is." He paused and drew our attention to a small ragged fragment still caught fast within the stitching. "And yet here, gentlemen, is a fragment of the missing leaf itself, left behind by whatever hand performed the cutting. Observe its edge." I looked, and saw at once what he intended. The fragment was dry, its margin faintly browned, as paper grows when it has lain long exposed to air and light, wholly unlike the raw whiteness of the cut beside it. "It is not possible," said Doring slowly, "for a single leaf to be both freshly severed and long absent." "No," said Holmes, "it is not possible, and yet here it is before us, demanding some explanation, since a fact once observed cannot simply be dismissed because it proves inconvenient to our theories." The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken at last by a small exclamation from Trent, who had entered unnoticed and now stood peering beneath the reading chair nearest the window. He straightened, holding out a slender object that caught the light. "A paper knife," said he, "lying beneath the chair, sir." Holmes took it from him and turned it over in his fingers. It was of chased silver, handsomely made, its blade blunt with age and use. "That is mine," said Eleanor at once, colour rising in her cheeks. "I had it with me in the library yesterday afternoon, cutting the pages of a novel. I must have set it down and forgotten it." "It could not have made this cut," said Holmes, testing the edge lightly against his thumb. "The blade is dull, and the severance we have examined required an instrument of considerable sharpness. Nevertheless," and here he glanced round the room, "its presence beneath this chair, so conveniently discovered, is a circumstance we shall not forget." It was Doring, opening the deed-box once more to replace the volume, who made the second discovery. A small object had lodged itself against the iron hinge, and he drew it forth with an exclamation of surprise. a tiny fragment of green sealing wax, no larger than a shilling, pressed with the faint impression of a signet. "That is my own wax," said Colonel Marcus, examining it with evident discomfort. "I use no other for my private correspondence, but I cannot account for its presence here unless it fell from my sleeve when I handled the volume yesterday afternoon. I had a letter to seal that very morning, and the wax was still soft in my pocket case." "A plausible explanation," said Holmes, "and one I do not for a moment dismiss. I would only observe, Colonel, that a dropped fragment of wax and a mislaid paper knife are both objects which identify their owners with the greatest precision, and neither requires any particular skill, cunning, or physical presence to explain. They tell us who was in this house. They tell us nothing whatever of who cut these pages, and when, and why." He turned to me as the others fell to a low, anxious discussion among themselves, Sir Edmund's voice rising once in something like despair before Doring's measured tones calmed him. "You will observe, Watson," said Holmes quietly, "that we are being offered 2 culprits before breakfast, each identified by an object rather than an action. That is a luxury real crime very rarely affords us. When guilt announces itself so readily, it is generally because someone wishes it to announce itself, and has taken considerable trouble to arrange the introduction." "Then you believe neither Eleanor nor the Colonel guilty?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that whoever severed these pages did so with a blade sharper than any paper knife, at some hour when both a discarded weapon and a stray fragment of wax might plausibly find their way beneath this chair and into that box. I believe further that the fragment left in the stitching is the most honest witness in this entire household, for it alone has not troubled to lie to us. It tells us that these pages were not new to their absence, they were merely new to our discovery of it." He closed his watch, which he had drawn out and consulted twice already, though for what purpose I could not then imagine, and turned toward the door. "Come, Watson, I think we had better examine that snow beneath the eastern window a good deal more closely than Sir Edmund's assurances have yet permitted us to do." Chapter 4. The Footprints That End. The storm, far from abating, seemed to gather fresh strength as the morning wore on. By noon the telephone line, which ran from the hall to the village 3 miles distant, had fallen silent altogether, and Trent reported that the drive itself lay buried beneath drifts that no cart or sledge could hope to cross. We were, for all practical purposes, as thoroughly cut off from the world as any garrison under siege, and I confess the knowledge lent a certain grim weight to the mystery we had come to unravel, for whatever hand had cut those pages from the Registry volume remained, of necessity, somewhere within these walls. Holmes spent the better part of the morning questioning the servants one by one in the small sitting-room set aside for the purpose, while I sat in a corner with my notebook, recording what I could of each account. It was tedious work, but Holmes conducted it with a patience I had seen him extend to few other pursuits, drawing out each witness upon the minutest particulars of the previous evening. Mrs. Merton was certain that she had examined both library windows at 9:30 and had found them fastened. Trent, questioned in his turn, admitted that he had passed the library door shortly before 10 and had seen a line of lamplight beneath it, though he had not paused to look within. Dr. Harcourt repeated his account of the chest pains, adding that he had entered Sir Edmund's chamber at 10 minutes past the hour and remained there until very nearly 11. Doring, for his part, insisted with some heat that he had retired precisely at 10, and that the chain about his neck had not once left his person, waking or sleeping, from that moment until the discovery of the theft. "A tidy sequence of hours," Holmes remarked to me afterward, as we stood together in the corridor, "and one which very nearly accounts for every soul in this house between 9:30 and 11 o'clock. Very nearly, Watson, not quite." It was shortly after this that we made our way out into the bitter cold to examine the ground beneath the eastern window, that same window through which Holmes had traced the strip of melted snow on the day of our arrival. The storm had eased for a brief interval, though the sky remained low and leaden, threatening a renewal of the assault before nightfall. Holmes moved along the wall with his usual deliberate care, and presently gave a low exclamation that brought me hurrying to his side. There, beneath a thin crust of fresh snow, ran a short line of footprints, 6 in number, beginning abruptly beside the foundation wall and ending as abruptly some dozen feet distant, without further trace in any direction. "Trent's boots, or I am no judge of such things," said Holmes, kneeling to measure the impressions against his own hand. a distinctive pattern to the sole, quite unlike the town-made article. Sir Edmund, who had followed us out despite the cold, seized upon this at once. "Then here is your intruder, Mr. Holmes." He approached during some lull in the storm such as we enjoy at this moment, and the later snowfall has covered the remainder of his trail, both coming and going. "That is the natural reading, certainly," said Holmes, "and I do not doubt it is the reading someone intended us to make. But observe, Sir Edmund, the direction in which these prints point. The toe falls here and here and here, each successive mark carrying the walker away from the window, not toward it. A man does not ordinarily leave a house by walking backward into it." Then he approached from another direction, and turned. "He might have done so," Holmes conceded, "were it not for a second circumstance more curious still. Look closely at the snow within each print, Sir Edmund, and compare it with the snow immediately surrounding it." He drew out his glass and invited each of us in turn to look. I did so, and though I could not have sworn to the distinction unaided, I saw well enough what Holmes intended once he had pointed it out. The snow filling the impressions themselves bore a faint granular crust, as though it had lain exposed to the air for some hours, while the snow about the prints was soft and freshly fallen, unmarked by any such weathering. "The prints, Watson, are older than the snowfall around them. Someone made these marks yesterday afternoon, in the ordinary course of some errand, and then, during the night or early this morning, deliberately brushed away the fresh snow that had since covered them, so that they might be discovered this morning and mistaken for the fresh tracks of a nocturnal intruder. The intrusion from without, gentlemen, was staged from within." Trent, summoned and confronted with the print of his own boot, did not attempt to deny its origin. "I was at that window yesterday afternoon, sir, right enough. There's a shutter come loose on its hinge, and I went round to see what wanted doing before the weather worsened. I'll own the print is mine. But I never went near that window last night, nor uncovered any track of mine on purpose. Why should I when it only points to me?" "That," said Holmes, "is precisely the question I have been asking myself, Mr. Trent, and I confess I have not yet settled upon an answer that satisfies me." It was later that afternoon, as I sat with Eleanor over tea in the small morning room, that I learned a fact which cast the whole affair in a rather different light. She spoke, with evident reluctance, of the terms of her uncle's will, explaining that Ashcombe Hall itself, quite apart from the disputed woodland, stood mortgaged rather more heavily than was generally known, and that should the woodland pass to Colonel Marcus, the loss of its rents and timber might well force the sale of the hall entire. "I should inherit nothing, Dr. Watson, but debts and an empty house," said she, with a candour that struck me as either wholly innocent or very cleverly calculated. "You may draw your own conclusions as to whether that gives me cause to wish those pages destroyed." I confess I did not know what to make of this confidence, and repeated it to Holmes that evening with some hesitation, half expecting him to seize upon it as decisive. He heard me out in silence, and then shook his head slowly. "A motive, Watson, certainly, and a strong one. But I find myself a great deal more interested at present in the clocks of this house than in the wills. The library clock, the hall clock, and the clock in the dining room, I have now compared all three against my own watch, and no two of them agree by more than a minute or so, save for the hall clock, which runs a full 5 minutes slow, and yet every soul in this house speaks of last evening's events, as though each clock told precisely the same hour. That is a very small inconsistency, Watson, but I have built larger cases upon slighter foundations. Chapter 5. What the Witnesses Wore. I had grown accustomed, over the years of our association, to Holmes's peculiar habit of attending less to what a witness said than to the small, unconsidered details of dress and manner that accompanied the saying of it. But I do not think I ever saw the method employed to better purpose than upon that third day at Ashcombe Hall. The storm had settled into a steady, monotonous fall, no longer violent, but sufficient to bury whatever the wind had spared, and Holmes, denied any further examination of the grounds, turned his whole attention upon the household itself. He conducted his interviews that morning in the library, seated behind the very table upon which the mutilated Registry volume had lain, and I observed that he asked remarkably few questions touching directly upon the theft, preferring instead to draw each visitor into some trivial discourse while his eyes performed their silent inventory. Colonel Marcus came first, still cultivating that air of amused patience which had marked him from our first meeting, though I fancied it sat upon him rather less easily than before. He wore, as he had each day, a pair of riding boots polished to a soldierly brilliance, and it was only as he crossed his legs before the fire that Holmes's gaze fixed upon a faint streak of pale clay marking one trouser cuff. "You've been walking, Colonel, in country rather different from the park," Holmes observed pleasantly. "That clay is not the soil of the lawns, which I examined yesterday and found a dark, peaty loam. It is paler, chalkier stuff such as one finds if I'm not mistaken about the old chapel." The Colonel's composure flickered, no more than a man's might who has been caught in some small social indiscretion. "I walked there Tuesday last, before ever this wretched business began, merely to stretch my legs. I see no crime in it, Mr. Holmes." "Nor do I suggest one," said Holmes, and passed to some other matter entirely, leaving the Colonel, I thought, rather more unsettled by the abandonment of the subject than he would have been by its pursuit. Eleanor followed, composed and watchful, and it was Holmes himself who drew her attention, with an apology, to a small thread of dark red wool caught upon the shoulder of her gown. "From my shawl, I imagine," said she, examining it without surprise. "I wore it in the library the evening before last, and it has always shed dreadfully upon anything it touches." "A handsome shawl, I have no doubt," said Holmes, and turned the conversation to her uncle's health, her own hopes for the estate, matters that seemed to me idle enough at the time, though I noted, when she had gone, that Holmes crossed at once to the library curtains and drew a fold of the heavy stuff between finger and thumb, comparing its weave, I supposed, with the thread she had unknowingly left behind. Doring's interview proved the briefest, and in some ways the most instructive. He answered every question with the same careful precision that marked all his dealings, but I observed, as had Holmes, that his hand strayed continually to the chain about his neck, touching the key that hung from it as another man might touch a talisman. "You wear that key even now, Mr. Doring, though the volume is safely locked away and the theft already accomplished," Holmes remarked. "A natural habit, formed of anxious days, no doubt. May I see it?" Doring surrendered the key without visible reluctance, and Holmes turned it beneath the library lamp for some moments before returning it. He said nothing of what he had seen, but later, walking with me in the gallery, he remarked that the bow of the key bore a small polished patch, such as might result from repeated pressing against some soft substance, wax or clay, sufficient to take an impression. "You believe the key was copied?" I asked, startled. "I believe it is a possibility we cannot yet dismiss, Watson, though Doring himself may know nothing of it, if the copying were done without his knowledge, at some unguarded moment. A key worn upon a chain about the neck is not so inviolate a thing as its owner supposes, particularly among a household where several persons have had ample occasion for a friendly clasp of the shoulder, or a moment's proximity in a darkened corridor. Mr. Bell's interview yielded a discovery of a rather different character. Holmes, in shaking his hand upon his entrance, remarked upon a dark stain marking the ball of his left thumb, though the young man wrote, as Holmes had already observed, with his right. "A leaking pen, Mr. Holmes, nothing more," said Bell with the eager anxiety that seemed to attend his every utterance. "I was obliged to refill my own 2 evenings since, and made a clumsy business of it." Holmes examined the stain closely, and I saw his expression sharpen, though his voice remained as mild as before. "An ordinary writing ink dries to a plain black, Mr. Bell, and washes from the skin within a day or 2. This stain retains a distinct blue undertone, and clings rather more stubbornly than any common ink has a right to do. It resembles, unless I am much mistaken, the special compound used in the annotation of official registry entries, rather than in the filling of an ordinary fountain pen." Bell's face lost what little colour it had possessed, but he offered no further explanation, and Holmes, with characteristic restraint, pressed the matter no further at that time. Dr. Harcourt, questioned last, proved as genial as ever, though Holmes's eye fell at once upon the dampness still clinging to the soles of his shoes, a dampness ill accounted for by his earlier assurance that he had remained indoors the whole of the previous evening. "I crossed the covered courtyard to my motor car for a case of medicine I had left there," Harcourt explained readily enough. "The snow had drifted even beneath that shelter, and my shoes suffered for it. A small matter, Mr. Holmes, and nothing to do with your library, I assure you." It was Mrs. Merton, encountered by chance in the corridor rather than summoned formally, who furnished the most curious contradiction of the day. She mentioned, in the course of some remark about the household's evening habits, that she had drawn the library curtains fast at 9:30, as was her custom, and had not touched them again. "And yet," said Holmes to me afterward, "Colonel Marcus told us only yesterday that he observed moonlight reflecting from the Registry volume at 10 o'clock, a full half hour after Mrs. Merton assures us those curtains were closed. Either the Colonel's memory has failed him, Watson, or those curtains were opened again by some hand between 9:30 and 10 and closed once more before morning. He fell silent then, gazing into the fire with that fixed inward look I had come to recognise as the outward sign of some intricate calculation proceeding behind his eyes. "I begin to suspect, Watson," said he at length, "that we're dealing not with one falsehood in this house, but with several, each independent of the others, each cast by a different hand, and each, quite unintentionally, obscuring the single lie that matters. They overlap like shadows thrown by objects of very different shapes, and it will require a steadier light than any we yet possess to tell one shadow from another." Chapter 6. The Agreement in Silence. It was on the 4th morning of our stay, the snow having at last relented into a thin, unhurried fall that scarcely troubled the already buried gardens, that Holmes announced his intention of examining the estate's financial position, a subject which had until then remained wholly outside my own consideration of the case. "A theft of paper, Watson, is seldom committed for the paper's own sake," said he, as we made our way toward the small estate office where Trent kept his accounts. "Somewhere beneath this affair lies a sum of money, and I have found, in my experience, that the surest way to a man's actions is very often through his ledgers rather than his conscience." Trent received us with a wariness that had not been present at our earlier meetings, and it was some time before Holmes's patient, unhurried questioning drew from him the fact that the disputed woodland was reckoned considerably more valuable than its timber alone might suggest. "There's coal beneath it, Mr. Holmes, or near enough," said Trent at last reluctantly. "Mineral rights, surveyed some years back and quietly set aside, worth a fortune to whoever holds the land outright. Sir Edmund's debts are heavier than he'd have the world believe, and that money would clear the greater part of them at a stroke." "And you knew of this survey?" Trent's weathered face coloured. "I did, sir, and I'll not deny that Colonel Marcus knew it too. He came to me some weeks back asking after the old estate maps, and I let him into the chapel where they're stored more than once of an evening. He gave me his word he'd see me kept on as steward, whatever came of the land, if I helped him satisfy himself as to its boundaries and worth. I believed him an honest claimant, Mr. Holmes, or I'd never have done it." Holmes received this confession without visible surprise, and it was scarcely an hour later, as we crossed the hall toward the morning room, that Eleanor herself sought us out, her manner graver than I had yet seen it. "I think, Mr. Holmes, that I owe you a fuller account than I have given," said she, closing the door behind her. "I did enter the library the evening the pages were taken. I had learned, from letters left carelessly upon my uncle's desk, that he intended to mortgage what remained of the estate, without so much as consulting me, though I am to inherit it, or what is left of it, one day. I went to the library that evening meaning to search his desk for further proof, not to touch the registry book at all. I did open the curtains, for the desk stands in a dark corner, and I needed the moonlight to read by. I dare say I caught my shawl upon them as I worked, and thought nothing of it at the time. And the volume itself. I never so much as opened it, Mr. Holmes. I give you my word." Holmes thanked her with a gravity that seemed to reassure her more than any protestation of belief could have done, and when she'd gone he turned to me with something very near satisfaction in his expression. "You begin to see, Watson, how these small confessions accumulate. Trent's evening visits to the chapel, Eleanor's search of her uncle's desk, each innocent enough in itself, and each, until this morning, carefully concealed." Our next interview proved yet more revealing. Dr. Harcourt, cornered at last by Holmes's quiet insistence, abandoned his account of the chest pains with something like relief. "There was no seizure, Mr. Holmes, or none worth the name," said he. "Sir Edmund asked it of me as a kindness, an excuse to remain above stairs while Eleanor was being questioned about the mortgage below. He did not wish to face her that evening, and I am an old friend, and a foolish one it seems, for I agreed to the deception without much thought for where it might lead." "A harmless enough lie in itself," Holmes observed, "though it has cost us a full evening's confusion in the reconstruction of events. I wonder, Doctor, whether you begin to regret the kindness." Harcourt had no answer to this beyond a rueful shake of the head. It remained only to seek out Doring, and here Holmes's questioning met with a resistance the solicitor had not shown before. Pressed upon the subject of the polished mark discovered on his key, Doring denied with some heat that any duplicate had ever been made, though he could offer no explanation for the mark itself beyond a vague suggestion that the chain might have pressed the metal against his waistcoat button in the ordinary course of wear. "Sir Edmund did instruct me, some weeks past, to inquire quietly whether the registry entry might be challenged upon some legal technicality, quite apart from the question of its authenticity, Doring admitted, when Holmes turned the conversation toward the estate's finances. It seemed to me a reasonable precaution given the family's difficulties, and I saw no reason to trouble Sir Edmund's niece or his cousin with the details of an inquiry that might come to nothing. Holmes accepted this without visible comment, though I noticed as we withdrew that his eyes had rested rather longer upon Doring's hands than the conversation itself seemed to warrant. It was that evening, as we sat together over a modest fire in the room set aside for our use, that Holmes summarised for me the whole curious pattern of concealment he had by then uncovered. Consider it, Watson, as a kind of silent agreement among the household, though not one any of them consciously arranged. Trent conceals his dealings with Marcus from fear of losing his place. Eleanor conceals her search of the desk from fear of her uncle's anger. Harcourt conceals a harmless fiction told out of loyalty. Doring conceals an inquiry undertaken, I believe, in good faith, but which he fears may appear otherwise. Each lie protects some private embarrassment, and none, taken alone, touches upon the theft of those pages. Yet together they have thrown so dense a fog over the true sequence of that evening that scarcely two accounts agree upon what hour any given event occurred. And the clocks, Holmes? You have returned to them twice now. I have, and I shall return to them a third time before I am done, for I have this evening learned, from Mrs. Merton, that Sir Edmund himself ordered the hall clock set 5 minutes slow some weeks ago, in expectation of a business visitor whom he wished to believe punctual regardless of the true hour. The library and dining room clocks were never touched. It is a small deception, Watson, and an old one, long since forgotten by its author, I dare say. But someone in this house has remembered it, and has used that 5 minutes with a precision no accident could explain. He rose and stood a while before the fire, his hands clasped behind him in the attitude I knew so well. We are very near it now, Watson. I feel it as a man feels the change of weather before the storm has broken. But I do not yet know whose hand cut those pages, and until I do, I think it best that this household continue to believe its several small sins remain its darkest secrets. Chapter 7. The Pages in the Chapel. We had scarcely finished breakfast the following morning when Trent burst into the drawing-room with a violence of manner so unlike his customary reserve that every person present started at his entrance. His coat was dusted with snow, his face flushed with cold and excitement in equal measure, and in his outstretched hand he held a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth, tied about with a length of common twine. "I have found them, Sir Edmund," he cried, "the missing pages, hidden beneath a loose stone in the old chapel floor. I went there this morning to see to the shutter, and my foot struck the stone, and I thought it a queer sort of looseness for flagging that has lain undisturbed these 20 years. The company gathered about him in a confusion of exclamation and relief, and Sir Edmund himself with trembling hands undid the twine, and drew forth the 2 missing leaves, a little damp about their edges but otherwise whole. Doring took them at once and spread them upon the table, and I own that even I, no expert in such matters, could see nothing amiss in their appearance. The signature, the seal, the close, cramped hand of the entry itself, all bore every mark of age and authenticity. It was Doring who first noticed the pencilled annotation in the margin, faint but legible, and read it aloud in a voice that seemed to catch upon the words, "Copied at E.V.'s instruction." A silence fell upon the room more profound than any that had preceded it. Sir Edmund's own initials, as every soul present knew well, were Edmund Vale, and the implication of that small pencilled line required no further elaboration. Colonel Marcus was the first to speak, his voice carefully gentle as a man might address an invalid. "I take no pleasure in this, Edmund, believe me, but if the note speaks truly, and it is your own hand that ordered the transfer copied those years ago, then I think we may settle the matter privately between us, without recourse to lawyers or to further unpleasantness. I have no wish to disgrace my own cousin before the county." Sir Edmund had gone very pale, and his hand shook as he set down the pages. "I remember no such instruction, Marcus. I give you my word, whatever that wretched note may seem to say. I have racked my memory these 3 days past, and can find in it no trace of any transfer, ordered or otherwise." "An old man's memory is not always so reliable as he supposes," said Marcus, not unkindly, though I thought I detected beneath the gentleness of his tone something very near satisfaction. It was at this juncture that Inspector Hales, a solid, sandy-haired officer of the county constabulary who had reached Ashcombe Hall 2 days before the roads closed entirely and had since been as thoroughly marooned as the rest of us, took charge of the discovered pages with the brisk assurance of a man who saw his duty plainly before him. He had, until this moment, remained rather in the background of our investigation, content to leave the finer points to Holmes, but the appearance of a signed confession, as it were, written into the very margin of the disputed entry, seemed to rouse in him a fresh and businesslike energy. Before he could pursue the matter further, however, Mr. Bell rose from his chair with an air of a man who could no longer contain some private burden, and addressed the company in a voice unsteady with emotion. "It was I who cut those pages, Mr. Holmes, not Sir Edmund, not anyone else in this room." I recognised, upon my first close examination of the volume, that the entry was irregular, the ink not quite matching the surrounding pages in tone, though I could not then have told you precisely why I mistrusted it. I feared for Sir Edmund, and I acted rashly, and alone, to remove the evidence before it could do him harm. I had a duplicate key, given me by Mr. Doring, though I ought never to have accepted it, and I let myself into the library and did what I have described. I hid the pages in the chapel because I knew of no safer place, and I dared not confess sooner, for fear of what it might mean for my position at the registry. Doring's face, throughout this extraordinary speech, had passed from astonishment to something very like fury. "I gave you no key, Bell. I've never possessed a duplicate of that key in my life, and I resent most strongly the suggestion that I did." Gentlemen, said Inspector Hales, raising a broad hand. "There will be time enough for the apportioning of blame. For the present, I think we have our man, and a written statement, properly signed, will serve very well until the roads open, and I can convey Mr. Bell to the county authorities." I glanced at Holmes, expecting some immediate objection, some flash of that quick, incisive scepticism I had seen him direct at lesser confessions than this. But he said nothing at all, merely watching Bell with an expression of grave attention that revealed nothing whatever of his private thoughts. When Hales pressed the young clerk toward the writing desk to set down his confession in full, Holmes offered no protest, but requested only, in a tone of the mildest courtesy, that the statement be made as complete and detailed as Bell could contrive, omitting nothing, however small, that he could recall of his movements that night. Bell, grateful for what he plainly took to be a kindness, bent to the task with evident eagerness, and the household, relieved beyond measure at so tidy a resolution to its troubles, began already to speak among themselves of packing, of the roads, of the ordinary business of life resuming once the snow at last permitted it. I confess that I too felt a certain relief at the confession, and said as much to Holmes as we withdrew from the drawing-room, leaving Bell still bent industriously over his statement. "You do not believe him, then," said I, more as observation than question, for something in his silence had already told me as much. "I believe, Watson, that Mr. Bell has told us a story which explains every fact he wishes to explain, and accounts for none of the facts I have actually observed," said Holmes, drawing on his coat as we made for the door. "He has said nothing of the fragment of old paper caught in the stitching, nor of the dust disturbed upon that upper shelf, nor of the 5 minutes by which the hall clock runs slow. A confession that answers only the questions asked of it, and none that were not, is generally a confession composed for the asker's benefit rather than the confessor's conscience. Then why let it stand?" "Because," said Holmes, pausing at the door and glancing back toward the drawing-room, where the company's relieved chatter still rose and fell, "a false solution, once believed, is a very useful thing, Watson. The true culprit, secure in the conviction that Mr. Bell's confession has closed the matter, may now feel emboldened to take some final step to secure what he has so nearly won. We shall let him take it." Chapter 8. The Wrong Kind of Dust. The household, believing its troubles all but resolved, settled that afternoon into an atmosphere of relief so pronounced that I could almost have mistaken Ashcombe Hall for an ordinary country house entertaining ordinary guests. Bell had completed his written confession, a document of some 3 pages, closely written and duly witnessed by Inspector Hales, and had been given, pending the reopening of the roads, a kind of gentle, informal confinement to his room, more a courtesy than a punishment, since flight across those buried moors was scarcely to be contemplated by any man in his senses. Holmes, however, showed not the smallest inclination toward relief. He asked Sir Edmund's leave to examine the recovered pages once more, this time at his complete leisure, and withdrew with them to the library, where he spent the better part of 2 hours bent over the table with his glass, his small chemical case, and a patience that would have exhausted a less devoted observer than myself. "Come and look at this, Watson," said he at last, beckoning me to his side, "and tell me what you make of it." He held the 2 leaves up against the window, the grey daylight passing through the fibres of the paper, and pointed to a faint pattern visible within it, a watermark of the kind I knew to be common in official stationery. "I do not pretend to your knowledge of such things, Holmes, but it appears an ordinary enough mark to me. It is an ordinary mark, certainly, but not, I think, an ordinary date. I wrote yesterday, by means of a note carried by young Bell before his confession, rather altered his usefulness to us, to a former acquaintance in the paper trade, a man who has supplied me with useful information upon more than one occasion. His reply reached me this morning, smuggled in with the post that Trent at last managed to bring up from the village on foot. This particular watermark, Watson, belongs to a batch of registry paper manufactured a full 2 years after the date borne by the disputed entry itself. I confess the implication took a moment to settle upon me. Then the pages cannot be genuine. They cannot be genuine as they stand, though the ink, the hand, and very possibly the seal itself may all be perfectly authentic in their origin. It is the paper alone that betrays them, and paper, Watson, is a singularly honest witness, since it cannot be persuaded to lie about its own manufacture, whatever is written upon its surface afterward. He drew my attention next to the seal itself, a small circular impression in red wax bearing the arms of the county registry, and indicated, beneath his glass, a hairline flaw running through 1/4 of the design. The registry's official die suffered precisely this damage, Watson, in a fall from its cabinet some 3 years past, an incident I recall from a case of Lestrade's touching upon a quite different matter of registry fraud in the southern counties. The die was repaired within the month, but never so perfectly as to erase all trace of the accident from a careful eye. This seal was struck from the damaged die, yet the entry before us purports to record a transaction from 6 years past, 3 years before that damage ever occurred. Then the seal, though genuine in its striking, could not have been applied at the time the entry claims. Precisely so, and there is a third matter, smaller than either, but to my mind the most conclusive of the 3. He produced the fragment of oilcloth in which the pages had been wrapped, and from its folds shook out a scattering of fine dark dust onto a sheet of white paper. I collected this from the wrapping before Inspector Hales bore the pages away for safekeeping. Chapel dust, Watson, such as one would expect from a disused stone floor, consists chiefly of mortar and plain grit. This contains, in addition, fine particles of coal and traces of leather fibre, neither of which have any business in a chapel that has stood cold and empty these 20 years. Coal and leather, I repeated. Where might such a mixture originate? I put that very question to Mrs. Merton this morning, in the guise of idle curiosity about the history of the house, and learned that the iron deed box now resting in this library was formerly stored in a strong room adjoining the old furnace room, close by the coal store, and that the box itself is lined within with worn leather, a common enough practice in boxes of its age and manufacture. The dust we have examined did not come from beneath a chapel flagstone, Watson. It came from the bottom of that very box. I stared at him, the full weight of the discovery only slowly making itself felt. Then the pages were never truly hidden in the chapel at all, until very shortly before Trent discovered them. They were wrapped in that oilcloth and dusted, I have no doubt deliberately, with a little genuine chapel dirt to lend colour to their supposed hiding place, only after their removal from the deed box and planted beneath that stone within a day, perhaps within hours, of Trent's convenient discovery of them. Holmes turned next to Bell's written confession, laid open upon the table where Hales had left it, and set it side by side with the disputed entry itself. Observe the formation of the letters in Bell's own hand, Watson, here in his signature and his statement, against the hand of the entry he claims to have merely cut away rather than composed. There is no falsehood in that particular, at least. He did not forge this. His letters run free and open, while the entry's hand is close and cramped, the work of a man schooled in an older, more formal style of official penmanship than young Bell, for all his registry training, has ever practised. We found Bell that evening in the small chamber to which he had been confined, and Holmes's manner toward him, though grave, held none of the accusation I had half expected. It was this gentleness, I think, more than any direct challenge, that broke down the last of the young clerk's resolve. "Someone learned of a foolish thing I did years ago, Mr. Holmes," he confessed at last, his voice barely above a whisper. a small alteration to a registry date, made to spare my father dismissal when illness had made him careless in his duties. I believed myself utterly ruined should it come to light, and when I was told plainly that it would, unless I confessed to a crime I had not committed, I saw no other course open to me. I cannot tell you who threatened me, Mr. Holmes. I dare not. Holmes pressed him no further that evening, and as we withdrew he permitted Inspector Hales to continue in his settled conviction of Bell's guilt, offering no word to disturb it. "Let the household believe the matter closed, Watson," said he, as we climbed the stair to our own rooms. "The true architect of this fraud believes it closed also, and a man who believes himself safe is very much more likely to betray himself than one who suspects he is watched. We have only to wait, and to watch closely in the meanwhile, for I think our culprit will not long resist the temptation to secure what remains of his scheme." Chapter 9. The Registry Reconstructed. Holmes gave orders the following morning that the entire household should assemble once more in the library, a request which Sir Edmund, still labouring under the impression that the affair had been settled by Bell's confession, received with some bewilderment. Nevertheless, by 10 o'clock we were all gathered there, Inspector Hales among us, the grey light of yet another overcast morning falling upon faces that range from mild curiosity to something very near dread. "I asked you here," Holmes began, standing before the great fireplace with the recovered pages in his hand, "because a confession has been made in this room which does not, upon close examination, agree with the facts. I do not say this to cast doubt upon Mr. Bell's honesty in coming forward, for I believe he acted, however mistakenly, from a real and painful fear. I say it because the true history of this fraud lies a good deal further back than any of us have supposed, and reaches, I regret to say, a good deal closer to this fireside than any of us would wish." A murmur ran round the room, and I saw Doring's hand tighten upon the arm of his chair, though his face remained composed. "Let us begin," said Holmes, "with the folio itself. It was not cut from the genuine volume during the night before last, as we were all invited to suppose. The fragment left behind in the stitching, dry and browned at its edge while the surrounding cut was fresh and white, told us as much from the very first morning. The true entry, the honest record of Sir Edmund's unbroken ownership, was removed from that volume years ago by someone with regular and unsuspected access to the county registry, and a false folio was sewn into its place, using old thread and paper deliberately aged at its edges to escape casual notice. "But the entry was examined, Mr. Holmes," Bell protested from the corner where he sat under Hales's watchful eye. "I saw it myself upon the book's arrival and thought nothing amiss. You saw a very skilful forgery, Mr. Bell, made skilful enough to deceive a careful clerk, though not skilful enough to deceive its own paper, which I have shown was manufactured a full 2 years after the date it claims to bear, nor its own seal, struck from a die not yet damaged at the time the entry pretends to record. That forgery, gentlemen, was the work of Mr. Percival Doring." Doring rose halfway from his chair, a protest already forming upon his lips, but Holmes continued without pause, his voice level and unhurried. "Some years ago, Mr. Doring learned, in the course of his professional duties, the true and considerable extent of Sir Edmund's indebtedness, a fact he kept, as was proper, in the strictest confidence. He learned also, through channels I have not yet fully traced, of the mineral wealth lying beneath the disputed woodland, wealth sufficient once realised to clear those debts many times over. He conceived a scheme, gentlemen, whereby the woodland should pass, upon paper at least, to Colonel Marcus, in exchange for a private commission upon its eventual sale, a scheme in which the Colonel himself, I believe, played the part of an innocent rather than a conspirator." "I knew nothing of any forgery," said Marcus, his face pale. "Doring told me he had uncovered an old forgotten transfer, valid but never properly registered until now. I believed I was claiming what was rightfully mine, God help me, and no more." "I believe you, Colonel," said Holmes, "and it is precisely that belief which made you so useful an instrument. When I was summoned to investigate the matter, Mr. Doring found himself in considerable danger, for he knew, better than any man alive, that his forged entry could not withstand a chemical or physical examination of the kind I was certain to make. He resolved, therefore, to remove the false folio from the volume himself, and to stage its disappearance as a fresh and inexplicable crime, one that would draw suspicion toward everyone in this house except its true author." Holmes turned now to the deed box, still standing open upon its table. He had, some weeks earlier, taken a wax impression of his own key, under some pretext of a document cabinet requiring a similar duplicate, and had a copy made. During dinner, on the night in question, He passed that duplicate to Mr. Bell, instructing him to open the box later that night and remove a document he claimed had been placed there in error. Bell, trusting his superior in the registry office, believed he was merely correcting some clerical oversight. "I lost my courage, Mr. Holmes," Bell said miserably. "I took the key, but I could not bring myself to use it. I returned it to him unused the following morning, before ever the theft was discovered." Which left Mr. Doring, gentlemen, with no choice but to act himself. He entered this library during the confusion created by Sir Edmund's supposed illness, a fiction arranged quite innocently between Sir Edmund and Dr. Harcourt for wholly unrelated reasons, but a fiction that served Doring's purpose admirably, since it drew every eye upstairs at the very hour he required the library to himself. He relied, moreover, upon a small and long-forgotten deception of Sir Edmund's own making, the setting of the hall clock 5 minutes slow. By that margin he was able to be seen retiring at 10 by the hall clock, while in fact entering this room some minutes later by the truer time kept in the library itself. He held up the severed leaves. He cut out the false folio with a blade a good deal sharper than Miss Vale's paper knife, which he left conveniently beneath a chair, along with a fragment of Colonel Marcus's sealing wax, dropped into the deed box with equal care. 2 objects that pointed toward 2 innocent persons and toward neither of them, upon reflection, plausibly at all. Mr. Trent's old footprints beneath the eastern window, made in the ordinary course of an afternoon's inspection, were uncovered during the night to suggest an intruder from without. "And the dust, Holmes," I could not help but interject, "upon the upper shelf? That, Watson, is perhaps the most human touch in the whole affair. When you rose that night and opened your door, hearing footsteps in the corridor, Doring, caught between the library and his own room with the folio in hand, had barely time to thrust it upon the nearest high shelf before Harcourt's approach, from Sir Edmund's chamber, gave him cover to withdraw unseen. He retrieved it later, once the corridor was clear, and it was that hurried concealment which left the small disturbance in the dust that first caught my attention. "The pale clay on my trousers," Marcus murmured half to himself. "From the chapel, from our meetings over the old maps. Nothing to do with the crime at all." "Nothing whatever, Colonel, save that it lent an appearance of guilt to an innocent errand, precisely as Doring intended. He hid the recovered pages beneath that flagstone only after Bell's confession had, as he supposed, closed the investigation, choosing a location already associated in this household's mind with your own secret dealings, so that suspicion, if it arose again, would settle upon you rather than upon himself. He coerced Mr. Bell's confession by threatening to expose a small, long-past indiscretion touching his father, a threat cruel in its precision, for it struck at the one weakness Doring, through his professional dealings, was uniquely positioned to know. Holmes drew, at last, from his breast pocket a single sheet, upon which certain lines had been rendered visible by some chemical treatment I did not recognise. This is the pencilled note found in the margin of the false entry, the note reading, as we were all invited to believe, "Copied at E.V.'s instruction." Beneath chemical enhancement, gentlemen, the indentation of the original pencil, pressed rather harder than the visible alteration above it, reveals a different initial entirely. The note was written, in truth, to read, "Copied at P.D.'s instruction," and altered afterward, crudely and in haste to implicate Sir Edmund instead. Doring's composure broke at last. With a sudden, desperate movement he snatched Bell's written confession from the table where it lay and thrust it toward the fire. But Holmes was before him, seizing his wrist with a strength I had not often seen him exert. "That will serve you nothing, Mr. Doring," said he quietly. "The confession contains a phrase, 'irregular entry requiring correction,' which I find also in a private letter of yours to the county registrar, written under your own hand some 18 months past. You dictated Bell's confession as surely as you forged Sir Edmund's ruin, and the evidence of both now stands beyond your power to burn." Inspector Hales, who had listened to this reconstruction in a silence broken only by his own slowly deepening frown, stepped forward at last and laid a heavy hand upon the solicitor's shoulder. Doring offered no further resistance, and within the hour was formally charged with forgery, conspiracy, coercion, and attempted fraud, his composure gone at last, leaving only a grey and diminished figure scarcely recognisable as the precise, controlled solicitor who had greeted our arrival 4 days before. Chapter 10. The Thaw at Ashcombe. By morning the storm had broken at last. I woke to a silence so complete, after 4 days of wind and driving snow, that I lay some minutes in my bed merely listening to it before I understood its cause, and when I drew back the curtain I found the moor transformed, white and dazzling beneath a sky of hard, pale blue, the sunlight striking off the drifts with a brilliance that made the eyes ache after so long an acquaintance with grey. Already, from the direction of the stables, I could hear the ring of spades and the low voices of men set to the clearing of the drive. Colonel Marcus sought us out before breakfast, finding Holmes and myself upon the terrace where we had gone to take the first clean air in days. He looked, I thought, older than he had upon our arrival, the easy geniality that had marked his manner then worn thin by the events of the past week. "I have spoken with Edmund this morning, Mr. Holmes," said he, "and told him plainly that I renounce whatever claim I believe myself to hold upon the woodland. I ought never to have accepted Doring's assurances so readily. I think, if I am honest, that I wish to believe them, for there has always been a certain resentment between my cousin and myself, some old grievance from our youth I need not trouble you with, and I let that resentment persuade me where a clearer head would have counselled caution. I have paid for it in a fortnight I shall not soon forget." Holmes received this confession with the same grave courtesy he had shown throughout our stay. A man's willingness to believe a convenient falsehood, Colonel, is very often the truest measure of what he most wishes were so. I think you will find your cousin readier to forgive an honest fault than a cunning one. We found Mr. Bell later that morning considerably restored in spirits, having agreed, at Inspector Hales's request, to give full evidence against Doring when the matter came before the assizes. Holmes spoke privately with the inspector on the young clerk's behalf, urging him with some firmness to distinguish, in whatever report he prepared, between Bell's youthful indiscretion touching his father's registry entry, a fault of loyalty rather than of true dishonesty, and his far graver role as an unwilling accomplice coerced by a man he had every reason to trust. "He was a tool in Doring's hand, Inspector, and nothing more," said Holmes. "The law, I trust, is capable of that distinction, even where a frightened young man was not. Hales, to his credit, promised as much, and I saw in Bell's face when the assurance was reported to him something of the relief of a man who has carried a burden a great deal longer than the 4 days of our acquaintance with him. Sir Edmund, meanwhile, had closeted himself with Eleanor for the better part of the morning, and when at last they emerged together, I saw between them an ease of manner that had been notably absent upon our arrival. He came to us directly, his hand extended to Holmes with a warmth he had not shown, even in the first relief of Bell's false confession. "I have promised my niece, Mr. Holmes, that no further decision touching this estate shall be made without her full knowledge, whatever the cost to my pride in admitting how near I came to ruin without her wisdom to guide me. We have agreed, she and I, to lease a portion of the mineral rights beneath the woodland, sufficient to clear the worst of my debts, while preserving the timber and the greater part of the land itself intact for whoever comes after me. A prudent settlement," said Holmes, "and I think a fairer one than the fraud that so nearly deprived you both of the choice." Trent, summoned before Sir Edmund that same afternoon, received a dismissal delivered with more sorrow than anger. His long service to the family and his evident good faith in believing Marcus's claim legitimate spared him any harsher consequence, though Sir Edmund made plain that a steward's trust, once compromised, however innocently, could not simply be restored. Dr. Harcourt fared little better in the interview that followed, though his offence had been the lighter one. Holmes himself spoke to the physician with unaccustomed severity, reminding him that a small deception told out of loyalty may yet obscure a truth of far graver consequence, and that a doctor's honesty, once loaned so casually to a friend's convenience, could not always be recalled when it was most needed. It was not until early afternoon, the drive at last cleared sufficiently for a carriage, that Holmes and I took our leave of Ashcombe Hall. Sir Edmund pressed our hands with a gratitude that plainly embarrassed him by its own depth, and Eleanor, standing beside him, thanked Holmes in words a good deal more measured, though no less sincere for their restraint. We drove away beneath a sky still hard and bright, the snow beginning already, in the strengthening sun, to slip in small glittering falls from the branches of the roadside firs. I sat for some time in silence, turning over in my mind the strange tangle of small deceptions we had unwound, before I ventured to remark upon it to Holmes. "It is a curious thing," said I, "that nearly every soul in that house had lied to us, in one particular or another, and yet only one among them had constructed the true crime. "That is very often the way of it, Watson," Holmes replied, drawing his coat closer against the sharp air. "Deception of itself tells us nothing of guilt. A man lies to protect his pride as readily as his liberty, to shield a private weakness as often as a private crime. The investigator's true labour lies not in discovering who has lied, for in any house of consequence someone always has, but in asking of each falsehood whether it serves the crime itself, or merely the vanity, the fear, or the affection of the one who tells it. And how is that distinction to be made? By reference always to the physical fact, Watson, which cannot itself be persuaded to lie, however cleverly the tongues about it may be trained. A watermark cannot pretend to an age it does not possess. A fragment of dust cannot choose its own origin. Testimony, however respectable its source, becomes a dangerous thing indeed when it is accepted without constant reference to such unyielding witnesses. I have set down this case in the years since, as I have set down so many others, chiefly for my own satisfaction in the recollection, though I believe it holds a lesson beyond the ordinary interest of its puzzle. Apparent impossibilities, as I had occasion to learn once more at Ashcombe Hall, generally rest upon some small, unnoticed assumption, and respectable witnesses, however sincere, may lead an investigator as far astray through their small private evasions as any deliberate villain could contrive. Behind us, as our carriage gained the high road, the snow continued its quiet retreat from the lane, opening once more the path that bound Ashcombe Hall to the ordinary world beyond its gates, to the courts, the assizes, and all the slow, unhurried machinery of law and truth that had so nearly been defeated by a single dishonest hand, and was saved, in the end, by nothing more remarkable than careful eyes that would not be satisfied with what they were merely told.